35 million Americans sat glued to their screens, hearts pounding, as J.D. Vance stood tall before Congress in a hearing that would change everything. Cameras rolled, lights burned bright, and in that moment, one senator did what many believed was impossible. He exposed Jasmine Crockett's hidden dealings with foreign powers, shaking the very foundation of trust in the nation's leaders. This wasn't just a political clash. It was a battle for the soul of America, broadcast live to a stunned nation. But how? How did one voice rise above the noise, above the spin, to reveal secrets so dangerous, so shocking, that even seasoned lawmakers were left speechless? Today we take you inside that high-stakes showdown, a moment that blurred the line between courage and career suicide, between patriotism and peril. And as you follow this dramatized retelling, know this: while the story is shaped for narrative power, the emotions, the dilemmas, and the questions it stirs speak to truths that are all too real. Sometimes it takes a fictional stage to reflect the deepest challenges of our time. Are you ready to uncover what so many tried to keep buried? Let's begin. Stay with us, because this is more than a story. It's a truth worth every second of your time. It was 2 a.m. in Washington, D.C., that strange, heavy hour where the city felt less like the nation's capital and more like a haunted relic of promises made and broken. J.D. Vance stood motionless on the narrow balcony outside his apartment, the chill of the night air cutting through his shirt sleeves. His gaze fixed on the Capitol dome in the distance, silhouetted against a sky that trembled with the first low rumbles of an approaching storm. The clouds above seemed to churn with the same unrest that gnawed at J.D.'s thoughts. He wasn't a man easily given to sleepless nights, but tonight felt different. The news channels had gone quiet, their endless panels of talking heads finally fading into static and reruns. But J.D.'s mind replayed every headline from the past week. Another cyber attack on critical infrastructure, whispers of foreign infiltration, digital fingerprints no one dared name out loud. He had grown up hearing Papa's voice in his head. Boy, you watch the cracks before the flood comes. That's when they think you aren't looking. J.D. tightened his grip on the balcony railing, the cold metal biting into his palm. The city below seemed at peace, but he knew better. That false calm, the lull before the storm, was the most dangerous time of all. Behind him, a muted television flickered in the dark. A local anchor's voice, low and uneasy, spoke of unexplained outages in government systems. The words barely registered, blending with the rhythm of raindrops beginning to tap against the balcony's edge. But then, the shrill chime of his encrypted phone sliced through the stillness. J.D. froze. He hadn't expected any messages tonight, and certainly not from that number. Heart beating faster, he stepped inside and lifted the device, its screen glowing with a single line. Incoming secure message. Decryption in progress. J.D.'s pulse quickened as the text resolved on the screen. A name flashed in his mind before he even opened it. Sam Rowland, the retired NSA analyst who had years ago warned him about unseen threats, a man who didn't reach out lightly. The message was short. No greetings, no pleasantries, just 6 words that made J.D.'s stomach knot. Check HR 3942. It's not what it seems. J.D. stared at the screen, feeling the weight of those words. HR 3942, the tech modernization bill? He'd skimmed its summary a few days ago. Standard bureaucratic jargon, or so it had seemed. But Sam Rowland didn't waste words, and he didn't send warnings at 2 a.m. without cause. J.D. moved to his desk, swept aside stacks of reports, and pulled up the full text of the bill. The rain picked up, drumming harder against the glass, as if echoing the sudden storm inside his mind. Clause after clause scrolled past his eyes. Digital infrastructure upgrades, contractor authorizations, cybersecurity partnerships. But tucked between the dense paragraphs, J.D. began to see them. Provisions so vaguely worded, so innocuous on the surface, they almost escaped notice. But their implications, the back doors they could open, the access they could grant, sent a chill through him deeper than the night air ever could. And then came the final seed of doubt, a footnote reference to a contractor he recognized from prior intelligence briefings, a firm whispered about in connection with cyber espionage, one with rumored ties to hostile foreign entities. JD leaned back, the storm now a full symphony beyond his window. His fingers tapped the desk, the same rhythm Pawpaw used when waiting for an answer. What was hidden in this bill? And who else knew? He glanced at his phone again, as if willing it to offer more. But the screen was blank, the message already auto-deleted per protocol. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. JD's instincts screamed. This wasn't just politics as usual, and somewhere deep down, he knew. This night was the beginning of something far bigger than himself. The storm outside had grown louder, but JD barely noticed. His eyes burned from the blue glow of his screen as lines of legislative text scrolled before him. The wording of HR 3942 seemed harmless at first glance. All the right phrases that would soothe the public. Modernization, innovation, enhanced security partnerships. But as JD dug deeper, clause by clause, something felt off. Beneath the surface, buried in legal jargon and cross-reference footnotes, he found what Sam's warning hinted at. Provisions that, in the wrong hands, would hand over control of critical digital infrastructure to contractors with foreign interests. JD's heart pounded harder with each new discovery. One section spoke of outsourcing system architecture to global partners with demonstrated experience. Another authorized the use of proprietary technology from companies not named but referenced in codes. Codes JD recognized from classified briefings. Names that had surfaced before in the shadows of cybersecurity investigations. Names linked to firms with quiet but undeniable ties to entities aligned with Beijing. The Capitol dome no longer seemed distant. In JD's mind, it loomed closer, as if bearing down on him with the weight of history. This wasn't just pork barrel spending or bureaucratic incompetence. This was something else, something deliberate. The thought sent a chill down his spine that the storm's wind could never match. JD knew he couldn't sit behind his screen all night. He needed more. Needed to hear it from the only man he trusted in times like these. Without hesitation, he grabbed his coat, the dossier printouts, and his keys. The storm had turned the streets of Washington slick and treacherous, but JD navigated the empty avenues, headlights cutting through sheets of rain. The diner was one of those forgotten places, the kind that didn't show up on tourist maps. A single neon sign flickered against the rain-smeared windows. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee and old vinyl filled the air. Sam Rowland was already there, seated in the darkest corner, his posture tense, eyes watching every movement through the glass. JD slid into the booth, the storm's fury muffled but not silenced by the walls around them. No handshakes, no greetings. Just the shared understanding between two men who knew the stakes. Sam didn't waste time. From inside his battered leather satchel, he produced a slim folder and pushed it across the table. No copies, no photos. You read it, you remember it, you give it back, Sam said, his voice low but edged with urgency. JD opened the folder and began to read. The dossier was a map, one that linked Bill's sponsors to think tanks, lobbying groups, and consultants. Names JD knew. Names he had seen on donation lists, at committee hearings, in quiet corridors where deals were struck far from public view. But what froze him was the thread that connected it all, a chain of influence stretching back to companies with known ties to China's cyber and industrial espionage apparatus. A cold rage swelled inside JD, not the fire of sudden anger, but the deep, chilling fury of a man who realized betrayal wasn't theoretical anymore. It was here. It was real. And it had woven itself into the very fabric of the government he had sworn to serve. As the rain lashed the windows and thunder rolled across the city, JD closed the folder, his decision already made. This couldn't be ignored. And as he rose to leave, his mind raced with the knowledge that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one about to break inside the Capitol walls. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind streets glistening with rain and a sky painted in pale gray. But inside JD, the storm still raged. The dossier's contents burned in his mind as he entered the Capitol, water dripping from the hem of his coat. His steps echoed down the marbled corridors, but the weight on his shoulders made every stride heavier. He had no choice now. The threat was clear, and it was his duty to act. JD's first stop was the office of Senator Corbin, an old friend and member of the Tech Committee. Corbin listened as JD laid out what he'd found: the buried clauses, the foreign ties, the risk of handing America's digital backbone to those who could one day weaponize it. But when JD finished, Corbin only shook his head, his expression equal parts sympathy and weariness. JD, this is standard legislation, Corbin said quietly. There's always foreign partnerships in tech. You can't build walls around the internet. JD clenched his jaw, frustration rising. You don't see what I see, Corbin. Or you don't want to. He tried again with others. Senators he respected, colleagues he'd stood beside in battles past. Each time he met polite nods, dismissive smiles, or thinly veiled irritation. Words like overreacting, paranoid, reading too much into it floated through the air. JD felt the walls closing in, not from enemies, but from those he'd counted as allies. The Capitol dome, visible through a tall window, seemed to loom larger now, a silent reminder of promises made to those who had sent him here. And in that quiet moment of rejection, JD's mind drifted back decades to another dome of sorts. The high, curved roof of the steel factory where Papa had worked, and where JD had spent so many childhood afternoons. He saw himself, a boy of 10, standing on the factory floor beside Papa's boots, watching as workers packed up machines destined for foreign shores. He could still hear the hum of those machines being shut down, the hollow echo that followed. And he could see the tight lines of worry etched on Papa's face as he muttered the words that had stayed with JD all these years. They'll sell this country one piece at a time if you let them. The memory cut through the fog of doubt trying to settle in JD's mind. He had seen this before, in different form, in a different age, and he knew deep down that the cost of silence was too great. Returning to the present, JD squared his shoulders. If no one else would stand, he would. He had done it before, in smaller fights against quieter threats. But this was larger and lonelier. But that didn't change what needed to be done. JD left the last office with no more allies than he had entered with. The building's grandeur felt cold, the flags on the walls hollow symbols without action behind them. But as he stepped back into the morning light, he felt a strange calm. The road ahead would be rough, but his path was clear. The lone watchman had taken up his post, and no storm, no silence, no political calculation would shake him from it now. The morning after his long, lonely walk through the Capitol's corridors, JD Vance sat in his office, a file of notes spread before him, though his eyes barely registered the words. The room was silent, but for the faint hum of the television in the corner, broadcasting live from the press gallery. He hadn't planned on watching, but the voice that came through the speakers pulled his attention like a magnet. On the screen stood Jasmine Crockett, the rising star of Congress, framed perfectly against a backdrop of American flags and banners bearing the words, "A New Digital Era." Cameras clicked in rapid succession, capturing the poised, confident figure who had mastered the art of charm and conviction in equal measure. Today, Jasmine began, her voice smooth, measured, and practiced, we unveil H.R. 3942, America's next great leap forward, a bill designed to modernize, protect, and propel our nation into a future worthy of its people. No longer will we lag behind. No longer will we allow outdated systems to jeopardize our economy or our security. We will lead. The room erupted in polite applause. JD's jaw tensed as he watched. He could see through the words, through the polished delivery. The very bill she praised as a shield was, in truth, a gateway, a Trojan horse hidden in plain sight. He leaned forward, his knuckles whitening around the coffee mug in his hand. On screen, Jasmine gestured to the row of individuals lined up behind her, CEOs and tech luminaries introduced as America's partners in innovation. But JD recognized the faces, or rather, the connections that lurked behind them. These were not simply innovators. They were executives whose companies had, through shell organizations and strategic partnerships, woven themselves into the fabric of foreign-controlled entities. Entities that intelligence reports had flagged in the margins, always just shy of public scrutiny. JD's fingers tightened unconsciously, and with a faint, almost imperceptible crack, the ceramic of the mug split beneath the pressure. A thin line of coffee dribbled onto the papers before him, spreading like the stain he feared HR 3942 would leave on the nation. He barely noticed. His focus was locked on the screen. Jasmine's voice continued, confident and inspiring. With this legislation, we embrace the future. Together with our private sector champions, the best and the brightest, we ensure that America's digital backbone is strong, resilient, and ready for the challenges ahead. JD's mind replayed the map from Sam Rowland's dossier, the web of influence and hidden ties that Jasmine now masked beneath patriotic rhetoric and well-placed applause lines. The room of reporters ate it up, heads nodding, cameras flashing, headlines already being written. He pushed back from his desk, the broken mug forgotten, coffee pooling at the edge of the file. Outside his window, the Capitol dome seemed to glisten under the noon sun, but to JD it cast a long, dark shadow across the city. The press conference ended with Jasmine flashing a bright, practiced smile as she posed for the cameras, shaking hands with the tech leaders at her side. The so-called partners who would soon hold the keys to America's most vital systems if this bill passed. JD exhaled slowly, his mind already turning. The stage had been set. The players had taken their positions, and he knew, if the nation couldn't see through the performance, it would be left blind to the danger until it was too late. The applause from Jasmine's press conference still echoed in JD's ears as night fell over the city. He hadn't bothered to clean the coffee stain from his desk. It was a reminder of what was at stake. His office, usually neat and orderly, had become a war room. Reports lay open, sticky notes covered the edges of his monitor, and a large whiteboard dominated the wall behind him. Empty for now, but not for long. JD hadn't come back alone. Sitting across from him was Emily, one of his most trusted young staffers, eyes sharp, fingers flying over the keyboard of her laptop. She had a gift for pattern recognition, the kind of mind that could spot connections others missed. Tonight, JD needed that gift more than ever. "Pull everything," JD said quietly. "Flight logs, donor records, lobbying disclosures. Let's see who's been paying for those smiles on stage." Emily nodded without looking up. Outside, the city was quiet, but inside the office, the tension crackled as if the storm had returned. Hours passed. The whiteboard began to fill, the red strings stretching from one name to another, each connection tightening the noose of truth around the bill's so-called champions. A technology executive who had stood beside Jasmine that morning was linked to a holding company with offshore accounts. Accounts that, according to old Treasury reports, had been flagged for transactions with Chinese government-backed firms. A donor who had hosted a fundraiser for Jasmine 6 months ago was also a board member of a think tank quietly pushing for expanded technology cooperation with Beijing. JD stared at the web as it grew more tangled, more damning. Each line, each pin, each photo added weight to the truth he had feared. This wasn't accidental. It was orchestrated. The phone on his desk buzzed, breaking the silence. A voicemail. JD hesitated before picking it up. The fatigue in his bones told him to ignore it, but something made him press play. A voice filled the room, cracked and tired but familiar. A man from back home. He recognized the name before the caller even said it. "JD, it's Mark. Mark Pritchard. You probably don't remember me, but we worked together on the factory floor before it all shut down. They let me go this week," said the plant's downsizing again. "I don't know where else to turn, but I saw you on TV once, saying you'd protect us. I hope you're still trying, JD. God knows we need someone to." The message ended, leaving the room even quieter than before. JD closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words settle. The map on the whiteboard blurred in his vision, but its meaning had never been clearer. Emily watched him, waiting for his next instruction. JD opened his eyes, the weight of duty pressing down harder than ever. "Let's keep going," he said, voice steady. "We haven't found it all yet." And as they worked through the night, the Capitol dome beyond his window stood silent and still, as if waiting to see whether one man's resolve could stand against the tide. By the time dawn broke over Washington again, JD knew he couldn't wait for the machinery of Congress to catch up. The web his team had uncovered was damning, but in a world of headlines and sound bites, facts meant little unless they could cut through the noise. So he made the call, not to a major network or a national paper, but to a small investigative outlet he'd worked with before, one that still valued digging for truth over chasing ratings. The reporter on the other end listened quietly as JD laid it out. The buried clauses, the hidden ties, the names behind the smiling faces at Jasmine's press conference. There was no drama in JD's voice, no exaggeration, only the steady urgency of a man trying to sound an alarm before it was too late. Within hours, the outlet published the story. The headline was direct, the details meticulously sourced. For a brief, hopeful moment, JD let himself believe it might spark the outcry that could stop the bill in its tracks. But that hope dimmed quickly. Mainstream media barely blinked. A few outlets picked up the piece, but their coverage softened the edges, framing JD's concerns as one senator's interpretation or a dissenting view. The morning talk shows moved on within minutes, returning to easier topics: polls, personalities, palace intrigue. JD watched from his office, disbelief tightening in his chest. Worse still was what came next. Jasmine's team moved fast, launching a slick PR campaign that painted JD as out of touch, a relic clinging to paranoia in a modern world. Social media filled with polished videos and catchy hashtags. Hashtag forward together, hashtag no to fear politics. Cable commentators echoed the script, calling JD's warnings fear-mongering and dog whistle politics. In hours, the narrative shifted. JD's name trended not as the whistleblower, but as the obstructionist, the lone voice trying to slow down progress. JD sat at his desk, staring at the television without really seeing it. His hands rested on the arms of his chair, fingers motionless, as if even his body had run out of ways to fight the tide. The Capitol dome outside glowed in the setting sun, but to JD, it looked more distant than ever, a symbol of how far the truth now had to travel to be heard. The phone rang. JD hesitated, half expecting another journalist or perhaps another critic, but the voice on the other end stopped him cold. "Don't back down, son." The words came with the slow, gravelly weight of a man who had seen too many fights and too many good men fold under the pressure. JD recognized the voice, a retired general, someone who had mentored him in his earliest days in Washington, a man who rarely spoke without purpose. "They're counting on you to get tired. Don't let them." JD closed his eyes, drawing a long breath. The tide was against him, but he wasn't done. Not yet. "Thank you, sir," JD said quietly, the resolve returning to his voice. And as he hung up the phone, the night crept in. But JD no longer felt alone in the dark. The days that followed felt heavier, the air in Washington thick with the quiet hum of battles not yet visible to the public. JD moved through the Capitol like a man carrying a weight no one else could see. The PR machine kept spinning its tail, painting him as the stubborn obstacle to progress. But he kept digging, kept watching, waiting for the break he knew had to come. It arrived in the most unexpected form. Late one night, as JD sat reviewing amendments to HR 3942, his secure line buzzed. The voice on the other end was low, cautious, unfamiliar, but determined. "I have something you need to hear, Senator," the caller said. "I can't do this over the phone. We meet in person. You'll know where. The garage under Easton Plaza. 30 minutes. JD barely had time to think. Instinct and experience told him to be wary, but the urgency in the voice left him no choice. He grabbed his coat, tucked his encrypted recorder into his pocket, and headed out into the cold night. The city streets felt different at this hour. Emptier, but not at peace. As JD pulled into the dark parking garage, every sound seemed amplified. The scrape of tires on concrete, the drip of water from rusted pipes, the distant rumble of a passing train. His headlights cut a narrow path through the shadows before he killed the engine. A figure emerged from behind a concrete pillar, hooded, shoulders hunched, eyes darting nervously as if every shadow concealed a watcher. JD stepped out slowly, his breath forming small clouds in the chill air. "You came alone?" the figure asked. "I did," JD said. "Now tell me why we're here." The man hesitated, then pushed back his hood just enough for JD to see a familiar face, a former aide from Jasmine's office, one who had disappeared from public view weeks earlier. "I can't stay long," the aide whispered. His voice trembled, whether from cold or fear JD couldn't tell. "They can't know I talked to you, but you need to understand. This bill, it's worse than you think." She promised them smooth passage. "The lobbyists, the ones tied to the firms you're worried about. I was there. I heard it myself." JD felt his pulse quicken. "You have proof?" The aide nodded, glancing over his shoulder before pulling a small flash drive from his pocket. "Audio. A meeting at a private residence 2 nights before the draft went public. She promised to push it through no matter what it took." JD took the drive, slipping it into his coat. The aide stepped back into the shadows, voice fading. "Don't let them win, Senator. I've done all I can." Moments later, he was gone, leaving JD alone in the dim, echoing garage. JD stood for a moment, absorbing what had just happened. The proof he needed was in his hands, but the danger had grown with it. The PR spin, the dismissals, they were shields for something far deeper. And now he had torn a corner of that shield away. As he climbed back into his car, JD knew this wasn't just about a bill anymore. It was about exposing what hid behind the curtain, embracing for whatever came when the curtain finally fell. The next morning, long before the city stirred, JD Vance sat at his desk, the flash drive from the parking garage resting beside his notes like a silent challenge. He'd listened to the audio through the night, Jasmine's voice, calm and assured, promising lobbyists that H.R. 3942 would glide through committee without resistance. It was the confirmation he'd feared and the fuel he needed. By noon, JD found himself seated in a closed-door committee hearing, the kind of room where the public's eyes couldn't reach and the real battles of governance were fought or avoided. The chamber felt colder than usual, its wood-paneled walls seeming to soak up sound rather than reflect it. Around the table sat senators, aides, and advisors, their faces a blend of weariness and calculation. At the head of the table, Jasmine Crockett sat poised, folders neatly stacked before her, expression serene. JD waited until the formalities ended, then leaned forward, his voice steady but edged with the tension of sleepless hours and hard truths. "Before we move forward, I need this committee to hear serious concerns about H.R. 3942, he began, sliding copies of his preliminary findings across the table. "There are hidden clauses that would grant foreign-controlled firms access to critical infrastructure and financial ties, documented, between sponsors of this bill and entities linked to foreign cyber operations. We can't look the other way." Jasmine's gaze didn't flicker. She let the room fall quiet for a beat, then folded her hands, her tone measured and just sharp enough to carry an air of condescension. "Senator Vance, paranoia is not policy," she said, her voice smooth as glass. "We're here to discuss legislation that positions America as a leader in a connected world. The kind of fear you're peddling only isolates us, weakens us. We need to think bigger, bolder." A murmur rippled through the room. JD saw heads nod, not just in agreement, but in relief. His colleagues were tired of conflict, tired of warnings, eager to embrace the comforting narrative Jasmine offered. Progress without peril, innovation without consequence. One senator cleared his throat. "I think we all appreciate Senator Vance's passion," he said carefully, "but this bill represents a global vision. It's time America stepped up as a collaborative leader, not retreated into suspicion." Another chimed in. "Exactly. We can't afford to fall behind because of hypothetical threats." JD felt the walls close in, the room shrinking around him. The documents he'd distributed lay largely untouched or were skimmed over with disinterest. His words, his evidence. They echoed in the chamber like shouts into a canyon, swallowed by the weight of consensus. For a moment he wondered if this was how it always happened. Betrayal not in a single dramatic act, but in small, comfortable choices that chipped away at vigilance. The hearing moved on, Jasmine deftly steering it back to friendly ground. Speaking of opportunity and leadership, her voice the voice of reason in a room unwilling to hear dissent. JD sat back, watching the performance unfold, the isolation pressing harder against him. But beneath the isolation, the fire in him burned brighter. If the room wouldn't listen here, he'd find a way to make sure the nation did. As the meeting adjourned, JD gathered his files, the weight of his task heavier than ever, but his resolve carved in iron. He left the chamber knowing the real fight had only just begun. The hours after the hearing bled into night, the city outside falling into restless slumber, while JD's office glowed with the cold light of computer monitors and the whiteboard still webbed in red string. JD stood at the window, the Capitol dome now just a silhouette against the dark, his reflection faint and hollow in the glass. The echoes of Jasmine's words, "Paranoia is not policy," still rang in his mind, but he had no intention of retreating into doubt. Not tonight. Emily and two other staffers worked quietly behind him, eyes flicking between documents, data streams, and archived news reports. The office, usually a place of order, had become a bunker. The tension was heavy, but so was the determination. Then came the sound JD had been waiting for. The sharp intake of breath from Emily as she leaned closer to her screen, fingers frozen on the keyboard. "Senator, you need to see this." JD turned from the window, crossing the room in quick strides. Emily pointed at the screen, where a company name glowed on a contract summary within HR 3942. A contractor positioned to play a major role in rebuilding core digital infrastructure. It was a name that had surfaced before, in quiet briefings and redacted reports. But what caught JD's eye wasn't just the name, it was the connection Emily had uncovered. "They were a subcontractor in that breach 2 months ago," Emily said, voice low but urgent. "The one that shut down parts of the grid in the Midwest. We always thought it was foreign interference through a third party. This is that third party." JD stared at the screen, the pieces locking into place in his mind. This wasn't just influence peddling. This wasn't just backroom deals or hidden donations. This was direct, immediate. A company with a hand in compromising America's critical systems, now poised through this bill to gain even deeper access under the guise of modernization. His heart pounded with the cold clarity of realization. "This isn't just corruption," JD said quietly, the words forming like steel in his throat. "This is treason masked as progress." The room fell silent at that, the weight of the truth pressing down on them all. For a long moment, JD let it settle, let the anger and the purpose it fueled sharpen his focus. Then he straightened, resolve hardening. "We're done waiting," he said, voice steady. "This goes public, next hearing. No more closed rooms, no more whispers. They'll hear it from me, loud and clear." His staff nodded, already moving to compile the findings into a form that could withstand the storm they knew was coming. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window as if the night itself understood the storm JD was about to unleash. The Capitol dome stood silent, watching over the city as it always did. But tonight to JD, it felt like it watched over him as well. As if the generations who'd fought to protect it waited to see if he'd rise to the challenge. And as dawn approached, JD knew one thing with unshakable certainty: he would not let them down. The city remained cloaked in night when JD stepped out of his office. The file clutched tight in his hand, as if letting it go might unravel everything. The streets were empty, slick with dew, the street lights casting long shadows that seemed to follow him as he walked toward the meeting place. There was no motorcade, no aide at his side. This was a mission he couldn't share. Not yet. The coffee shop where they had agreed to meet had long since closed for the night. JD spotted the journalist waiting at a table out front, a figure hunched beneath a worn coat, face half hidden in the glow of a street lamp. The man rose as JD approached, his handshake quick and firm, his eyes sharp and questioning. "Thanks for coming," JD said quietly. "I wasn't sure you'd actually ask," the journalist replied. "You've been playing this close." JD nodded, glancing around at the empty street. "I have to. What I have, it's not just politics. This could break everything wide open." The journalist gestured toward the file. "Show me." JD opened it between them, pointing to the links, the contracts, the connections. The company named in the bill that had already played a role in a cyber attack. The proof of foreign influence dressed up as innovation. The promises Jasmine had made behind closed doors. The web Sam Rowland had helped him see, and that Emily and the team had traced to its darkest corners. When he finished, the journalist leaned back, the weight of it settling in. His face was pale beneath the lamp's yellow glow. "You know what they'll do if you take this public, don't you?" he said, voice low, serious. "They'll try to destroy you, JD. Not just your career, you. They'll smear you, isolate you, make you look like a madman or a traitor yourself. You ready for that?" JD didn't answer right away. He looked past the man, past the street, past the night itself, seeing the Capitol dome rise in his mind, and beyond that, the faces of the people who had sent him here. Mark Pritchard's voice echoed again. "I hope you're still trying." "I don't have a choice," JD said at last. "This isn't about me." The journalist nodded slowly. "Then you've got my word. We'll get it right. No spin, no games." They shook once more, then parted, JD walking alone beneath the thinning night. The first light of dawn painted the horizon when JD reached the small cemetery on the edge of town. He moved between the headstones, the air cold and still, until he found the grave he sought. The simple marker bore Mama's name, and beneath it, the dates of a life spent working, fighting, sacrificing. JD stood in the hush of morning, the storm inside him quieting as he spoke aloud. Voice steady, meant for her and for himself. "I'll do right, Mama, whatever it costs." The wind stirred the trees as if carrying her unseen blessing, and as JD turned toward the city awakening in the distance, he felt the storm gather at his back. Not just the storm of danger, but of purpose. The city came to life with the first full light of morning, but JD Vance's office felt like it belonged to a different world entirely, one where sleep was a luxury long abandoned. The blinds were drawn, the lamps dimmed, and the air thick with focus. JD and his team worked in near silence, broken only by the rustle of papers, the tap of keys, and the soft creak of chairs shifting under the weight of exhaustion. On the long table at the room's center lay the arsenal they had built, financial records tracing donations and contracts back to shadowy intermediaries. Meeting logs revealing private gatherings between key sponsors of HR 3942 and lobbyists with foreign ties. Transcripts and notes from intercepted communications that hinted at promises made and debts owed. Each document was another piece of the puzzle, and together they formed a picture that, once revealed, could not be unseen. JD moved among the papers like a general before a battle, eyes sharp despite the deep lines of fatigue carved into his face. His suit hung looser than usual, his tie loosened at the collar, but there was a fire in his gaze that kept his team going. He paused often, tracing lines on a map of connections pinned to the wall, double-checking references, rereading key points to be sure nothing had been missed. Emily watched him quietly, worry in her eyes. When the moment felt right, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Senator, maybe we need to think this through. Once this goes public, there's no walking it back. There's still time to bring this to leadership behind closed doors, work through official channels." Another staffer nodded in agreement, the unspoken concern plain on his face. They weren't just assembling evidence. They were painting targets on their own backs. JD stopped at the table, resting his hands on either side of a stack of files. He looked up, meeting the gaze of each person in the room, his voice steady, the weight of his words grounding them all. "If we stay quiet, we're part of it." The silence that followed was heavy, but not hopeless. His team nodded, the moment of doubt replaced by renewed resolve. They knew what was at stake, and they knew their boss would not flinch. Hours passed in focused preparation. JD reviewed the files again and again, his eyes red-rimmed, but clear. He made notes in the margins, highlighted key points, rehearsed the sequence in his mind. There would be no room for error. The case they were building had to be airtight, the truth so undeniable that even those most eager to look away would be forced to face it. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the city, as if the Capitol itself braced for the storm JD was preparing to unleash. And inside that office, beneath the weight of duty and danger, JD Vance stood ready, not just to speak, but to fight. When the decision was made, it happened quickly. JD instructed his staff to arrange for a special televised committee hearing. No closed doors this time, No secret chambers where truth could be buried beneath politics and platitudes. The date was set for just 2 mornings later. It would be early to ensure the networks could carry it live and the public could see what too many in the Capitol had tried to ignore. News of the hearing spread fast. In the hours that followed, JD became a lightning rod for mockery from Jasmine's camp. Social media filled with carefully crafted memes. JD's face superimposed on conspiracy theorists. His warnings twisted into sound bites made to look ridiculous. Videos circulated, set to upbeat music, depicting him as a relic of a fearful past while Jasmine's polished image was framed as the face of progress. JD's team tracked it all, but he told them not to waste energy responding. The smears were predictable, the noise inevitable. Their job was not to win a meme war. Their job was to deliver the truth. Still, JD felt the weight of it. Each click of a keyboard in his office seemed louder. Each notification from a news feed, each alert about another viral post, pressed against him like the rumble of distant thunder before a storm. His colleagues in the Senate sent polite, cautious messages, suggestions that perhaps the hearings should be postponed, reconsidered, softened. JD said nothing. The time for reassurances had passed. On the eve of the hearing, he stayed late in his office, reviewing his notes one last time. The file in front of him was worn now from repeated readings, the corners bent, the pages marked with annotations in his steady hand. Each note was a reminder of the facts, the links, the promises broken and the dangers ignored. He had built this case not for headlines, not for revenge, but because the truth demanded a voice, no matter the cost. Outside the window, the first pale glow of dawn crept over the horizon. The Capitol stood bathed in that soft light, its dome rising above the city like a silent sentinel. JD stood there for a long moment, his reflection faint in the glass, his mind quiet despite the storm swirling around him. He thought of Mama's grave, of the promise he'd made. He thought of the voices that had urged him to give up, and of the few that had told him to stand firm. Most of all, he thought of the people who would be watching in the hours ahead. The millions who counted on those inside these walls to protect the nation's future, even when it meant facing uncomfortable truths. Behind him, his staff worked quietly, preparing statements, checking equipment, finalizing details. The city beyond the window stirred to life, but inside that room, the focus was absolute. JD took one final breath, straightened his notes, and turned from the window. The stage was set. The players had taken their places, and now it was time for the truth to be heard. The hearing room was filled to capacity long before the gavel came down. Cameras lined the walls, their red lights glowing steadily, transmitting every glance, every word to millions watching across the nation. JD could feel the weight of those unseen eyes, the anticipation thick enough to taste. The air carried that charged silence, the kind that falls before a storm breaks. JD sat still as the committee chair called the session to order, his notes laid neatly before him, hands folded, eyes steady. When his turn came, he rose slowly, adjusting his jacket, the file of evidence in his grip, firm but measured. He began not with anger, not with bombast, but with the quiet strength of a man who knew the truth was his ally. His voice carried across the chamber. Not loud but clear, each word chosen with care. Ladies and gentlemen, today I rise not in opposition to progress, nor to innovation, nor to the future. I rise in defense of something older, something that should bind us all, regardless of party, of ideology, of ambition. That something is loyalty. Loyalty to the nation we swore to serve, to the people who placed their trust in these seats, and to the principles that built this republic. He let the words settle, scanning the faces before him. Some avoided his gaze, others met it but with guarded expressions, wary of what was to come. JD continued opening the file, his fingers steady despite the thrum of adrenaline beneath his skin. House Resolution 3942 promises modernization, but let us look closely at what it truly contains. He moved through the bill line by line, clause by clause, projecting excerpts on the monitors for all to see. He pointed to language so deliberately vague that its danger lay hidden in plain sight. Provisions that authorized foreign-controlled contractors to design key systems, Grants that would funnel taxpayer dollars to companies with ties flagged in classified briefings, partnerships that would embed hostile influence at the heart of America's digital backbone. The room shifted as he spoke. Senators who had entered confident, perhaps dismissive, began to glance at one another, to shift in their seats. Aides whispered behind folders. The hum of the cameras seemed louder now, their lenses capturing every tightening jaw, every furrowed brow. JD's voice remained steady, the force of his words gaining momentum with each revelation. He spoke of the grid breach tied to one such contractor, of the quiet assurances given behind closed doors, of the chain of influence traced in the documents his team had compiled. "This is not theory," JD said, his voice rising just enough to fill the chamber's corners. "This is not speculation. This is fact. Documented, detailed, undeniable. And if we fail to act, if we allow ourselves to be lulled by comforting words and easy promises, we do more than fail ourselves. We fail our country." The tension was palpable now. Even those who had once dismissed his warnings could feel it. The cold hand of doubt tightening its grip. The hearing was no longer routine. It had become something else, a reckoning. And as JD laid down the first blows in this battle for truth, the nation watched, breath held, waiting for what would come next. The room, once so confident in its routine, now seemed to lean in as JD turned to the final pages of his file. The murmurs that had rippled through the chamber during his earlier presentation faded into a charged silence. Even the cameras, though still and unfeeling, seemed to press closer. JD's hand rested on the cover of the dossier, the true weight of his case, as he drew in a slow breath. "There's more," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less firm, the kind of quiet that made people listen harder. "What I have next is not theory, not interpretation, not projection. What I have is their own words, their own promises, their own plans." He opened the dossier, the papers crisp and stark against the polished wood of the table. He read first from an email, a senior lobbyist writing to a board member of a firm with known foreign ties. The words were clinical, but the meaning cut deep. "We have assurances from Representative Crockett that H.R. 3942 will pass committee without revision." JD paused, letting that sink in before moving to the next. Another email, this one shorter, but no less damning. "Our contacts confirm she is fully committed to smooth passage. No obstacles anticipated." The senators around him shifted again, some exchanging glances, some looking down at their notes as if hoping to find escape in the fine print. But JD wasn't done. He reached for the small recorder, its silver edge gleaming beneath the chamber lights. With steady hands, he placed it on the table and pressed play. Jasmine's voice filled the room, unmistakable, confident, the tone of private assurance so different from her public speeches. "We'll make sure the bill moves clean. No surprises. I'm committed to that. You'll have what you need to move forward." The words echoed through the hall, sharp and undeniable. The silence that followed was total. The cameras caught it all. The frozen faces, the clenched jaws, the dawning realization that what was once dismissed as paranoia now stood revealed as fact. JD lifted the dossier high enough for all to see, then slammed it down onto the table, the sound loud in the stillness, a final punctuation to all he had laid bare. His voice rang out, steady, clear, edged with the passion of a man who could no longer stomach the cost of silence. "How many more times must we sell out America before we wake up?" The force of the question seemed to reverberate off the very walls. The weight of it settled on every person in that chamber, and on every viewer watching from their homes, their offices, their shops. Jasmine opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. For the first time, her poise faltered. The practiced smile, the polished composure, both slipped away, leaving only the raw shock of being unmasked. She tried again, but the words tangled, the sentence unfinished. The cameras caught it all, broadcasted to a nation holding its breath. JD stood tall, not triumphant, but resolute. This was not victory, not yet, but it was truth, laid bare. And for now, that was enough. The sound of JD's final words. "How many more times must we sell out America before we wake up?" still hung in the chamber as if the very air refused to move. For a heartbeat, for two, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, like a dam breaking, the storm erupted. Outside the chamber, news alerts flashed across every screen, every device. Vance exposes foreign plot in Congress. Bombshell hearing rocks Capitol. Senator Vance unveils hidden ties in tech bill. Networks scrambled to cut into programming, anchors' voices rising in shock as they reported live on the unfolding spectacle. Social media feeds exploded, hashtags trending within minutes. Hashtag Vance reveals, hashtag truth in the chamber, hashtag foreign plot unmasked. Inside the room, the silence was shattered by the sudden hum of activity. Aides rushed to their senators' sides, whispering urgent counsel, sliding papers, pointing at their phones. Some senators rose to speak, only to falter under the weight of what had just been heard. Others sat motionless, faces pale, as if still trying to process the enormity of the evidence JD had laid bare. At the center of it all, Jasmine Crockett sat frozen for a moment longer. The practiced smile was gone. The polished composure had crumbled. Her fingers, which only an hour ago had rested so confidently on her notes, now fidgeted at the edge of the table, searching for something solid to hold on to. She stood finally, but the usual grace with which she commanded a room was nowhere to be found. Her steps were hurried, uneven, as she gathered her papers, or perhaps merely something to do with her hands, and moved toward the exit. The cameras tracked her every movement, zooming in on the cracks in the image she had so carefully built. Reporters' voices followed her down the hall, shouting questions that went unanswered. JD remained standing at his place, the flood of noise around him growing louder by the second. Reporters filled the doorway, cameras swarmed toward him, microphones jostled for position. Questions came rapid fire. Senator Vance, do you believe this will halt the bill? Do you fear retaliation? Will there be an ethics inquiry? Do you have more evidence? But JD barely heard them. His gaze was fixed not on the cameras, not on the chaos that now engulfed the room, but beyond it, on the flag that hung above the chamber. The stars and stripes moved ever so slightly in the draft of the air system, but to JD it seemed to ripple with purpose. It was for that flag and all it represented that he had stood his ground. He drew a slow breath, steadying himself. This was not the end. It was only the beginning of the storm he had unleashed. The road ahead would be long, treacherous, filled with more battles to fight. But for this moment, for this one breath, he allowed himself the quiet satisfaction of having spoken the truth in a place where so many tried to bury it. And as the questions kept coming, as the cameras kept flashing, as the news crawlers continued their breathless updates, JD stood tall beneath the flag, unmoved by the storm, ready for whatever came next. The hours that followed JD's bombshell hearing felt like the eye of a storm, the eerie quiet that comes after the first wave, when the air still crackles with electricity and everyone waits to see where the next blow will fall. Across the nation, headlines continued their relentless march. Vance forces tech bill to collapse. DOJ opens foreign influence probe. Crockett silent as bill withdrawn amid scandal. JD sat in his office, the weight of it all pressing on his shoulders. The Capitol seemed to hum with tension. From the window, the dome looked unchanged, but JD knew better. Inside these walls, the ground had shifted. By the next morning, the sponsors of H.R. 3942 announced the bill's withdrawal, citing the need for further review, a thin veil over the truth that it had been sunk by the force of JD's revelations. The Department of Justice released a statement that same day, confirming what JD had expected. A formal investigation was underway into potential foreign interference in legislative processes. But victory, if it could be called that, came at a price. JD's inbox overflowed, some messages filled with gratitude, praise, and pledges of support. Veterans groups, small business owners, and ordinary citizens from across the country sent notes of thanks, calling him brave, calling him a patriot. But mingled with those were the other kind, the threats, vile and venomous, promises of ruin, of harm, of vengeance for daring to disrupt powerful interests. Security around JD tightened. His usual detail was doubled. Plainclothes officers shadowed his movements, and his home became as much a watchpost as a refuge. Yet none of that weighed on him as heavily as the look in his wife's eyes when he finally returned home that night. She stood in the doorway as he stepped inside, weary beyond words, the world's noise still ringing in his ears. For a moment, neither spoke. She simply crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him, holding him as if to shield him from all that waited beyond their walls. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but edged with a worry he could feel down to his bones. "I'm proud of you," she said, "but I'm scared, JD. This isn't just politics anymore. They'll come for you, and maybe for us." JD rested his forehead against hers, drawing strength from the woman who had stood by him through every battle. "I know," he whispered, "but I couldn't turn away. You know I couldn't." She nodded, tears she refused to let fall glistening in her eyes. "I know, and I wouldn't want you to." That night, as JD lay awake, the house quiet around him, he listened to the wind outside and thought of all that had led to this moment. The cost was higher than he had imagined. The path ahead would be harder still, but the truth had been spoken. The fight had begun, and come what may, he would not regret standing when it mattered most. The city that had once felt so full of purpose now seemed hollow as JD moved through it. The headlines had shifted from shock to speculation. The rush of support and outrage had given way to quieter, more dangerous currents. Whispered conversations, closed-door meetings he was no longer invited to, eyes that once greeted him with respect now looking past him or away entirely. JD knew what he had sacrificed. The bridges he had burned weren't accidents. Each one had been set aflame by the choice to speak, to stand, to act when silence would have been safer. Allies who had praised his integrity now called him reckless behind his back. Committees he had once helped shape began scheduling meetings without him. The invitations dried up. The calls stopped coming. That night, unable to sleep, JD pulled on an old hoodie and left the house. He walked alone, the city lights casting long shadows across the streets. The National Mall stretched out before him, quiet, its monuments bathed in soft white light. He kept his head down, hands in his pockets, anonymous in the darkness despite the storm he'd unleashed. Each step echoed with memory. He passed the reflecting pool, its surface rippled by a soft breeze, and saw in its broken mirror not just the man he was now, but the man he had been. His mind drifted to that first day in the Senate, the crisp suit, the bright eyes, the heart full of ideals. He had stood on these same steps back then, looking out at the Capitol dome, feeling its history settle on his shoulders like a mantle. He had believed then that the battles would be clear, that lines well drawn between right and wrong, that truth once spoken would rally allies and shame the corrupt into retreat. But time and experience had reshaped that vision, sanding away the edges of idealism, revealing the murkier truths of power. Tonight the dome still glowed against the dark, but to JD it seemed heavier, as if the weight of all its unspoken compromises pressed down on it, and on him. He paused near the Lincoln Memorial, gazing up at the stone face carved in quiet strength, and wondered if even the greats of history had felt this same loneliness when they chose the harder path. A voice drifted through his mind, his own from that first day when he had whispered a promise to himself beneath that very dome. Do right, no matter the cost. The words had seemed simple then. They felt harder now, more complex, but no less true. JD stood there in the hush of night, the city's hum distant, the monuments silent witnesses to his thoughts. The road ahead was uncertain, littered with the debris of burned bridges and unseen threats. But as he turned back toward the Capitol, the soft wind carrying the faint rustle of flags, he felt the steel of his resolve strengthen once more. Come what may, he had chosen his road, and he would walk it alone if he must. The days that followed JD's lonely walk through the mall brought no grand parades, no roaring crowds. But quietly, steadily, a different kind of recognition began to take shape, one that mattered far more to him than headlines or television panels ever could. Editorials appeared in newspapers across the country. Not all, but enough to be felt. Writers who had once questioned JD's tactics now acknowledged the courage it had taken to stand where few dared. Words like integrity, principle, and sacrifice appeared in columns that reached kitchen tables and coffee shops in towns JD had once walked as a boy. The praise was measured, but it was honest. Letters began to arrive at his office, handwritten notes in careful script, emails typed late at night by men and women who had long since stopped trusting those in power to listen. Veterans groups wrote to thank him, not for winning, the battle was far from over, but for fighting when it counted. Small business owners sent messages, sharing stories of struggle and hope, their voices joining in a quiet chorus that reminded JD why he had chosen this path in the first place. And so, when the opportunity finally came to return home for a weekend, not for a rally, not for a speech, just to breathe the air of the place that had shaped him, JD took it. The drive out of the city felt different this time, as if the weight of Washington slipped from his shoulders with every mile. The highways gave way to back roads, the skyline to open fields, and at last to the small town where his name was known, not for headlines, but for the boy he'd once been. JD pulled into the gravel lot of a diner that had stood on the same corner for generations. The sign was faded, the paint chipped, but the smell of coffee and frying bacon that met him at the door was as warm as he remembered. Inside, heads turned as he entered. Not with fanfare, not with ceremony, but with the quiet acknowledgement of neighbors who understood what it meant to stand tall in a storm. He made his way to the counter, nodding greetings, accepting a few handshakes offered without words. The owner, an old friend of his father's, poured him a cup of coffee without asking. "You did good, son," the man said simply, his voice low enough that only JD could hear. JD met his gaze, saw the sincerity there, and felt a knot loosen in his chest. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying the weight of all he couldn't say. He sat there for a long while, nursing his coffee, watching the town move around him, the familiar rhythms of people who worked hard, spoke plain, and expected their leaders to do the same. And for the first time in many weeks, JD allowed himself to feel something close to peace. The fight wasn't over. The road ahead was still uncertain, filled with challenges that would test him anew. But here, in this quiet place, among those who mattered most, JD found the vindication that headlines could never give. And as he stepped back out into the sunlight, the flag above the diner stirring gently in the breeze, he knew he had done right, and that would always be enough. The chamber was quiet as JD Vance rose from his seat, the weight of the moment settling over him like a familiar coat. The final debate on H.R. 3942, or what little remained of it, had come at last. The bill, gutted by amendments and investigations, stood as a ghost of its original form, but JD knew the battle it represented was far from over. He stepped forward, the room watching, the cameras once more trained on him, though he paid them no mind. His focus was on the faces of his colleagues, on the place itself. This chamber where generations before him had risen to speak for those who could not. JD began slowly, his voice measured but sure. "Mr. President, colleagues, fellow servants of the Republic, I rise today not in triumph, not in bitterness, but in duty. We have debated this bill, we have seen what lay beneath its surface, and we have been reminded, some of us painfully, that vigilance is not a luxury. It is the price of our freedom." He let the words settle, his gaze sweeping the room. "I did not come to this body expecting to fight these battles. Like many of you, I came with hope, with faith in the promise that we could build together, lead together. I believed in the strength of our institutions, the wisdom of our laws. And I still do. But I have learned, as we all must, that those institutions, that wisdom, require our constant care, our constant defense." JD paused, hands resting lightly on the podium, eyes steady. "I think often of my papa, a man with little schooling but great sense. He told me once, in standing in the doorway of a factory that was shipping its last machines overseas, 'Boy, they'll sell this country one piece at a time if you let them.' Those words stayed with me, even when I wished they wouldn't, even when I thought perhaps he'd been too hard, too cynical. But today, I know better. He wasn't warning me about businessmen or politicians. He was warning me about complacency, about the slow erosion that comes not from enemies at our gates, but from forgetting to guard the gates ourselves. His voice gained quiet strength, the chamber listening, the usual distractions of staff and devices forgotten. This is not about one bill. It is not about one senator, or one committee, or one scandal. It is about the Republic, the fragile, precious thing entrusted to us. I ask only this, that we remember our oath, that we stand as watchmen, as guardians, that we do not mistake convenience for courage or comfort for duty. JD drew a slow breath, the silence in the room deep and respectful. I have no illusions about what comes next, but I have faith in this body, in our people, in the strength of truth. Let us protect what was given to us at such great cost. Let us leave it stronger than we found it. He stepped back, his words hanging in the chamber, a reminder and a challenge. And as he took his seat, the flag above the dais seemed to stir, as if saluting the promise he had renewed. The chamber emptied slowly after JD's speech, colleagues rising in thoughtful silence, some offering him quiet nods of respect, others slipping away without meeting his gaze. But JD barely noticed. He gathered his notes with care, as if they held something fragile, and made his way back to his office, the weight of the moment settling on him like a familiar companion. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting the Capitol in a soft, golden light that spilled through his window as he entered. The room was quiet, a refuge from the noise that always followed public words. JD loosened his tie, sank into his chair, and let the silence wrap around him. On his desk, among the stacks of reports and letters, one envelope caught his eye. It bore no official seal, no typed address. Just a name, written in careful script, and the marks of a hand that had taken time to form each letter. JD hesitated for a moment, then picked it up and opened it. The paper inside was lined, folded neatly, the ink a little smudged as if the writer's hand had trembled or the pen had paused. JD began to read. Senator Vance, I don't know if you'll ever see this, but I needed to write. I watched the hearing with my son. He's 16. He's been losing faith in this country, in all of us. He thinks no one stands for anything anymore. But when he saw you speak, saw you stand your ground when it would have been easier to stay silent, he looked at me and said, maybe there's hope after all. I just wanted you to know, because of you, my son still believes in this country. And so do I. JD's hands lowered the letter slowly to the desk, his eyes lingering on the final line, the weight of those simple words greater than any applause or headline could have carried. Without a word, he reached for the small frame that had stood on his desk since his first day in office. The photo of Mama and Papa, side by side on the porch of the house where he had learned what it meant to fight for what mattered. He placed the letter beside it, resting his hand on both for a long moment, grounding himself in the legacy that had shaped him and the future he still hoped to serve. Outside, the flag stirred gently in the evening breeze, a quiet reminder that some stands echo far beyond the walls where they are made. In a modest living room hundreds of miles from Washington, a boy sat cross-legged on the carpet, eyes fixed on the television. The screen flickered in the dim light, casting shifting shadows across his face. JD's speech played again, a replay on the evening news, his words clear and steady. Let us protect what was given to us at such great cost. Let us leave it stronger than we found it. The boy leaned closer, his breath held, the usual restlessness stilled by the quiet force of those words. His father watched from the doorway, arms folded, a flicker of pride softening features worn by long days and hard years. When the screen faded to a commentator's summary, the boy turned, his voice small but certain. Dad, I want to be like him. And in that moment, hope rekindled, the kind that shapes dreams and, in time, builds futures. Far away, JD walked the paths that wound past the Capitol, the dust casting long shadows across the city he served. The air was cool, the hum of traffic distant, the great dome rising behind him like a sentinel. He walked without entourage, without fanfare, the weight of recent days carried quietly on his shoulders. He thought of the boy who'd written the letter, of the millions like him, watching, waiting, needing to believe that truth still mattered, that courage still had a place in the halls of power. JD's steps were steady, each one a silent vow. The fight for America, he knew, never truly ended. It lived on in each choice, each voice raised for what was right, each hand extended to build rather than to break. And as the first stars pricked the sky, JD lifted his gaze, the quiet strength in his eyes mirroring that of the flag that stirred above the Capitol. A symbol of all that was, all that could be, and all that was worth the cost of standing. This story reminds us that true leadership is not measured by applause or headlines, but by the courage to stand firm when it matters most. J.D. Vance's journey shows how defending truth and integrity often comes at great personal cost, yet it plants seeds of hope for the next generation. His actions remind us that safeguarding a nation's values requires vigilance, sacrifice, and a willingness to walk the lonely road when necessary. In a world where it is easy to stay silent, J.D.'s stand encourages us to believe that one voice can still make a difference. What about you? Have you ever witnessed someone stand up for what's right, even when it wasn't easy? How did it inspire you? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.